I thought life was perfect, a rock-solid marriage, a daughter who'd married the kind of man any father would be proud of, and dreams of a picture-perfect future. But what I didn't see were the cracks that had already started forming right under my nose. My wife, Susan, though, she saw it. Our daughter began pulling away, making flimsy excuses for late nights and missed visits. I brushed it off as newlywed stuff. But Susan knew better. Turns out, sometimes ignoring the warning signs is the biggest mistake you can make, and I was about to learn that the hard way. Something's not right, she mentioned one evening after Emma had dropped in for dinner but seemed glued to her phone the whole night. I looked up from the TV, more annoyed at being interrupted than concerned about what she was saying. What do you mean, not right? She's busy. That's normal. You're blowing this way out of proportion. But Susan's not the kind to just drop things. Busy, she shot back. She barely glanced at John all night. He didn't seem to notice, but I did. Something's going on. I can feel it. I rolled my eyes, not because I didn't believe her, but more because it's just what I do. Still, there was a little voice in the back of my head starting to nag. What if Susan was onto something? The thought of Emma, my little girl, keeping things from us made me uneasy. I wasn't ready to face it, but the doubt had started to creep in. Susan began poking around, asking more questions. She couldn't help herself. She'd call Emma in that casual way, asking about her day, trying to get a read. But the more Susan prodded, the more distant Emma seemed. I could hear it in Susan's voice each night after they'd hang up, frustration, disappointment, and something else I didn't want to think about. Worry. Tom, she's hiding something, Susan said one night, pacing back and forth in the kitchen after another strained conversation with Emma. She's avoiding me. Avoiding us. Maybe she's just overwhelmed, I offered, grasping at straws. I honestly didn't know what else to say. What was I supposed to think? My mind just wasn't where Susan's already was. But then, there were the phone calls Emma would take in another room, how she'd quickly end our conversations when John's name came up, and the growing number of excuses for why they couldn't make it to our family dinners. One or two of those things, no big deal, but combined. It was starting to paint a picture I didn't want to see. Before long, Susan's concerns turned into full-blown detective work. I knew she was spending hours scrolling through social media, trying to piece it all together, searching for anything that would explain Emma's odd behavior. She even mentioned the idea of following Emma around, which I shut down immediately. That was a line I wasn't ready to cross. At least not yet. But Susan, she wasn't waiting around for me to catch up. I noticed a shift in her too. It wasn't just Emma growing distant, Susan started pulling back from me as well, frustrated that I didn't seem to be taking her seriously. And honestly, that's what worried me the most. Our marriage had always been strong, or so I thought, but even we were beginning to feel the weight of Emma's secrets. Meanwhile, John, poor guy, was completely in the dark. Every time we saw him, he was the same upbeat, easygoing fella, chatting about his job, their future together, making big plans for vacations. He had complete faith in Emma, and the thought of that trust being shattered, it tore me up inside. Looking back now, it all seems so clear. The late nights, her phone constantly in her hand, the flimsy excuses, and that awkward, nervous laugh whenever we asked her anything too direct. But when it's your own kid, you tend to look the other way. You don't want to see the truth. But Susan, she couldn't let it go. One evening, after weeks of simmering tension, she finally reached her breaking point. I'm going over there, she declared suddenly, snatching her keys off the counter. What? Now? It's almost midnight, Susan. I was startled by the determination in her voice, but I also knew there was no stopping her once she'd made up her mind. She left her jacket here the last time she came by. I'll just drop it off. Maybe. I don't know, maybe I'll see something, she mumbled, her voice wavering with a mix of hope and anxiety. I didn't argue. I didn't even try to stop her or suggest I tag along. I just watched her walk out, figuring this was just another one of Susan's impulsive moments. I thought she'd come back and we'd laugh about how paranoid we'd been acting. But I couldn't have been more wrong. That night turned everything upside down. When Susan came home hours later, I knew right away something had happened. She stepped through the door like she'd seen something she couldn't unsee. Her face was drained of color, her eyes wide and empty. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. "What happened?" I asked, feeling my pulse hammering. My gut told me I wasn't going to like what she had to say. Susan stared at me, and in a voice so soft it was almost a breath, she said, "I saw her, Tom. I saw Emma, with another man." I remember that moment as if it just happened. The way she looked, ashen, shaking as she clutched her purse. I didn't need her to spell it out. You just know when someone's been hit with a truth so heavy it can't help but shift everything. Susan took a deep, shaky breath, like she didn't want to make it real by saying it out loud. But she had no choice. "I saw her, Tom," she repeated, eyes glistening. "Emma, with another man." It felt like the whole room started spinning. Like I'd been knocked clean off my feet. My first instinct was to push back. "No," the word just slipped out, almost like a reflex. "That's not something you ever expect to hear, not about your own kid. You never think you'll be that parent. The one whose child, your pride and joy, isn't who you thought they were." "No," I said again, shaking my head before I could even think. But deep down, I knew Susan wasn't making this up. She didn't exaggerate. She never did. She slumped into a chair, her whole body collapsing like the weight of it all was just too much to bear. I stepped closer, standing right in front of her, trying to wrap my head around what she was saying. What was going to happen next? Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with fear, disgust, and confusion, all tangled up together. "I just went to drop off her jacket," she murmured, her voice shaking. "I thought it'd be a quick stop, you know. But when I got there, the lights were on, and I could hear voices inside. I wasn't going to snoop, Tom, I swear I wasn't. But then I saw her through the window." She hesitated, struggling to find the words, her voice dropping lower. "She was in bed, with some man." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I just stood there, my brain racing, trying to catch up. "Are you absolutely sure it was her? I mean, maybe." "Don't." Susan's voice cut through sharply, cracking as she spoke. "It was her, Tom. Our daughter. And she saw me." I blinked, still trying to process. "She saw you?" I asked, my own voice sounding hollow. "What did she do? What did she say?" Susan let out a harsh, bitter laugh that made my skin crawl. "She invited me in." I just stared at her, my mind spinning. "Invited you in? For what?" "To join the fun," Susan spat, her face contorted with disbelief and something close to rage. She acted like it was nothing. Like it was completely normal to be cheating on her husband. Like I'd just go along with it. I felt a sick churn in my gut. My own daughter behaving like this? It was unfathomable. Emma had always been strong-willed, sure, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. My thoughts were scrambling, trying to piece together some reason, some excuse for why she would do something so reckless and cruel. But there was nothing. No explanation that made any sense. Susan pushed herself up from the chair, pacing back and forth, her words coming out faster, more frantic. I told her no, of course. And then I got out of there as fast as I could. But she didn't even try to stop me, Tom. She didn't care. Our own daughter. She doesn't care. I could barely register what I was hearing. The shock of it. The sheer betrayal. But what hit me hardest was the casual way Emma had treated her mother, the complete disregard for everything we'd ever taught her. I didn't know what to say. Hell, what could I say? It felt like everything was falling apart, and I had no idea how to even begin putting the pieces back together. She's not the girl we raised, Susan went on, her voice trembling. She's changed. I don't know what happened, but she's not the same Emma. And now we're stuck in this mess. I sank into a chair, burying my head in my hands. I felt utterly lost, torn between that deep fatherly instinct to shield my daughter and the raw, painful sense of betrayal tearing at me. What the hell was I supposed to do? How do you even begin to fix something like this? We have to talk to her, Susan said suddenly, her tone shifting to something almost fierce. We have to confront her. She needs to understand what she's done. Confront her. I repeated, still dazed. And say what? Hey, we know you're sneaking around on your husband. What the hell are you thinking? Susan shot me a hard look. Yes, that's exactly what we say. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Hell, I wasn't ready for any of this. But what choice did we have? Emma wasn't just making a small mistake, she was blowing her life to pieces. And if we didn't step in now, who knows how much worse it would get. But it was more than that. The way Susan described Emma's reaction, the complete absence of guilt, the arrogance, made me feel sick to my core. This wasn't just about cheating anymore. It felt deeper, darker. My little girl wasn't simply making a bad decision. She'd become someone else entirely, and I couldn't even recognize her. The following days were strained. We barely exchanged words. The weight of what Susan had witnessed hung over us like a dark cloud, suffocating any attempt at normal conversation. I kept waiting for Emma to call, to fess up, to show even a hint of regret. But she didn't. She just kept living her life as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't been caught in one of the worst possible ways. The tension was unbearable. Susan wasn't sleeping. Her anxiety ate at her every single day. And me? I was angry. Not just at Emma, but at myself. How had I missed the signs? How did I let it get this far without seeing what was happening? It was my job to protect my family, to guide Emma, and I'd dropped the ball. One evening, after yet another sleepless night of tossing and turning, Susan made her decision. We're talking to her. Tomorrow, she said firmly. There was no point in arguing. I knew she was right. We couldn't keep dodging this conversation. So we made a plan, to confront Emma at her apartment while John was at work. We didn't want to blindside him until we knew just how deep this mess went. We'd give Emma a chance to explain herself, to own up to it, to show that maybe, just maybe, there was some sliver of remorse hidden beneath it all. The next day rolled around faster than I wanted. My stomach churned the entire drive over. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to hear her excuses or whatever justifications she'd come up with. But I had to. For Susan, for John, and, honestly, for myself. As we pulled up to Emma's apartment complex, I felt the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me like a lead blanket. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. I didn't know it at the time, but after this conversation, nothing would ever be the same for our family again. The drive felt like the longest damn trip of my life. Susan sat next to me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, jaw clenched so hard I could almost hear her teeth grinding. I knew she was fuming, but it wasn't just rage. It was heartbreak, disappointment, confusion, all mixing together into a storm that was about to crash down on our daughter. And me? I didn't know what to feel. A part of me still clung to denial, like if I just ignored it a little longer, things would somehow go back to how they were. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't something we could sweep under the rug. When we arrived at Emma's building, we sat in the car for a long moment, neither of us making a move. It was like we both needed to gather ourselves before stepping into the chaos that was waiting for us inside. Emma just shrugged, her face calm, almost detached, like we were the ones overreacting. It's not about being bored, Dad. It's about freedom. John's a good guy, really, but I need more than just good. I need excitement. I need something that makes me feel alive again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And sneaking around with some guy behind your husband's back is how you get that excitement. For God's sake, Emma, what happened to you? Her eyes narrowed, and her tone turned defensive. Nothing happened to me. I'm just being real with myself. You and Mom live in this fairy tale world where marriage never changes, but that's not how it works. People change. Relationships change. Susan shot up from her seat, her face pale with fury. So, your solution is to just cheat on the man who adores you because you need a little more thrill? Is that what you're saying? Emma didn't back down. Look, I didn't plan for this, okay? It just happened. I wasn't out looking for it. But when I met him, it clicked. And I'm not going to throw it away because of some outdated idea of what marriage is supposed to be. Outdated? I snapped. This isn't about some old-fashioned view of marriage, Emma. It's about trust, commitment, loyalty. You made promises. You don't get to just throw them out the window because you're bored or want more excitement. Emma looked at me like I was the one who didn't get it. You're acting like I've blown everything to pieces, but I haven't. John doesn't even know. I can still fix this. Fix it? Susan asked, her voice now a strained whisper. How exactly do you think you're going to fix this? I'll tell him, when the time is right, Emma said, as if it were the simplest plan in the world. I'll explain it. He'll understand. Susan let out a bitter, hollow laugh that seemed to fill the room. You really think he's going to understand? That man loves you, Emma. He trusts you. And you've been lying to him, sleeping with someone else behind his back. How could you do that to him? Emma looked away, finally showing the smallest flicker of emotion, maybe frustration, maybe regret. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could control it. But things just spiraled. I couldn't hold back anymore. So, what now? Are you going to keep lying to him? Keep sneaking around until everything crashes down? No, she said firmly. I'm going to end it. I just need a little more time. Susan shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You don't understand, do you? It's already falling apart. You're tearing your marriage to shreds, and you can't even see it. There was a long, painful silence as Emma looked down at the floor, avoiding our gaze. I could see it in her eyes, she wasn't ready to face the reality of what she'd done. Maybe she never would be. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice low and drained. You need to tell him, Emma. You can't keep hiding this from him. He deserves to know the truth. She bit her lip, looking torn for the first time since we'd walked in. I will. Just, give me a little more time. No, Susan said, her voice steady and firm. We're done giving you time. If you don't tell him, we will. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. You wouldn't, she whispered, but there was a quiver in her voice now. For the first time, I saw fear. Real, genuine fear. We would, I said quietly. He deserves the truth. And if you can't bring yourself to do it, we'll have to. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might break, might show some remorse. But instead, she just glared at us, her jaw clenched. Fine, she spat. I'll tell him. But on my terms. You have no right to interfere. Susan's expression softened, but her resolve stayed firm. You have one day, Emma. One. If you don't tell him by then, we're going to. Emma's face went pale, but she nodded stiffly. One day, she whispered. We turned and left the apartment without another word. As we walked down the hallway, I felt like I was in a fog, everything muffled and distant. This was our daughter. Our little girl. How did we get here? When we got back in the car, Susan's shoulders started to shake, and I realized she was crying. I reached out and squeezed her hand, feeling utterly helpless. "What are we going to do, Tom?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I looked straight ahead, feeling the same hollow ache in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I just don't know." "What?" "You can't do that," Emma gasped, her voice rising with panic. "We can," I replied firmly, standing up and locking eyes with her. "And we will. John deserves to know the truth about the person he's married to." Emma jumped up too, her face paling, panic written all over it. "You'll ruin everything. He won't understand." Susan wiped away a tear, her expression hardening. "That's a chance we're willing to take, Emma. But you have to face the consequences of your actions." Emma didn't respond. She just stood there, trembling slightly, her face drained of color. I could see it, she wasn't just afraid of losing John. She was terrified of losing the life she'd built, the image she'd worked so hard to maintain. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out, and whether she liked it or not, John was going to know. As we left her apartment, a heavy weight settled in my chest. This wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. The drive home was a blur. My mind was spinning, replaying every word, every flicker of emotion on Emma's face over and over. I kept wishing it was some awful nightmare that I'd wake up from, but the harsh reality clung to me, pressing down like a boulder. Susan sat quietly beside me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I didn't know what to say. Our daughter had torn our world apart, and now we were about to destroy John's too. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Susan. We just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the enormity of what we had to do choking us both. I kept picturing John's face when we told him, the shock, the disbelief, the betrayal. He didn't deserve any of this. He was a good man. Too good for someone who'd treat him the way Emma had. By morning, the dread had only tightened its grip. Susan was barely holding it together. She paced the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to make coffee that neither of us could stomach. "How are we supposed to do this, Tom?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperation. I had no answer. How the hell do you shatter someone's world like this? There was no way to make it easier, no way to soften the blow. "We have to tell him," I finally said, though the words felt empty. "It's the right thing to do." Susan nodded, but I saw the pain in her eyes. She knew it was right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. We called John, asked him to come over, told him we needed to talk. I could hear the confusion in his voice, probably thinking it was just something trivial, maybe about some family get-together or a casual catch-up. I hated what was coming for him, hated it with every fiber of my being. When John arrived, he was smiling, like always. He had no idea the bomb we were about to drop on him. He hugged Susan, gave me a strong handshake, and sat down at the kitchen table, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit him. "What's up?" he asked, still grinning. "Everything okay?" Susan couldn't speak. She just stared down at her hands, her face tense and pale. I knew it was on me to get the words out. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "John," I started slowly, feeling the weight of every word, "there's something we need to talk to you about." His smile faded, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it? Is everyone all right?" I glanced at Susan, and she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was now or never. I swallowed hard, feeling the lump in my throat tighten. "It's about Emma," I managed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "There's something you need to know, something we wish we didn't have to tell you." John's face shifted from concern to confusion, and then to something closer to dread. He leaned forward, his gaze darting between us. "What do you mean? What's going on?" The words felt heavy, like each one was a weight I could barely lift. "Emma, she's been seeing someone else." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could see the gears turning in his head, could see the disbelief flash across his face. He just sat there, staring at us like we'd spoken a different language. "What?" he whispered, shaking his head. No, that can't be right. She wouldn't. Emma wouldn't do that." "She did," Susan whispered, her voice breaking. "I saw it with my own eyes, John. I'm so sorry, but, it's true." For a moment, he just sat there, like he was frozen in place. And then, slowly, the reality of it began to sink in. His face crumpled, the shock turning into something darker, something raw and painful. "No," he said again, but it sounded hollow, like even he didn't believe it anymore. "No, no," he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the truth tore into him. I reached out, wanting to do something, to offer some kind of comfort, but I knew there was nothing I could say that would make it better. "I'm sorry, John," I murmured, feeling utterly useless. "We didn't want to have to tell you like this, but you deserve to know." He looked up at us, his eyes red and glassy. "Why?" he whispered, his voice thick with pain. "Why would she do this?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know. I wish I did." We sat there in silence, the three of us, the only sound in the room the ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of John's quiet sobs. Our world, his world, shattered into pieces on that kitchen table. And none of us knew how to put it back together again. The weight of what we had to say bore down on me, and I felt like it was going to crush me right there. "John," I started, my throat tight, almost choking on the words. "We need to talk to you about Emma." His brow furrowed, and he leaned forward a little, concern etched across his face. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. "This is it, she's been unfaithful to you." The words seemed to hang in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. John blinked, staring at me as if he hadn't heard right. "What?" he whispered, his voice uncertain, as if I'd spoken in a language he couldn't understand. Susan managed to find her voice, though it shook. "I saw her, John. I saw her with another man. She didn't even try to hide it." His face contorted, first in confusion, then in disbelief, and finally, something darker, the slow, awful realization. His eyes darted between us, searching desperately for some sign that this was a mistake, that we were wrong, that there was any other explanation for what we were telling him. But there was nothing. We had nothing but the cold, harsh truth. John leaned back in his chair, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide with shock. "No," he murmured, shaking his head slowly. "That can't be right. Emma wouldn't, she wouldn't do that." "She did," Susan whispered, her voice cracking. "She's been seeing someone else. And the worst part is, she didn't even care that I saw her. She acted like it didn't matter." I watched as John's disbelief shattered. The denial, the hope, it all crumbled in a split second. His expression broke, and I could see the pain flood his eyes. His hands were shaking, his head moving from side to side as if he could shake the reality away. "No. No. She wouldn't do that to me." I wished I could say something, anything, to soften the blow, but there was nothing. No words that would make this easier to bear. "She did," I said softly, my voice barely more than a breath. "I'm so sorry, John." His fists clenched on the table, knuckles white with the strain. "Who is it?" he asked through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with rage and agony. "Who's the guy?" Susan and I exchanged a helpless look. We hadn't even thought to ask Emma for his name. At the time, it hadn't seemed like the most pressing question. But now, seeing the fury and the devastation in John's eyes, I realized we should have. I don't know, Susan admitted, her voice small. I didn't recognize him. John stared down at the table, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. He stayed like that for a long time, the silence in the room thick and unbearable. I could practically see the battle raging inside him, denial, anger, heartbreak, all twisting and churning just beneath the surface. I don't understand, he finally said, so quietly I almost missed it. I did everything right. I loved her. I supported her. I don't understand, his voice cracked, and he looked up at us, his eyes filled with a pain so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. I thought we were. I thought we were happy. The agony in his voice cut through me like a knife. I wanted to reach out, to tell him it wasn't his fault, that none of this was because of him. But I didn't know if he'd even be able to hear it right now. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too brutal. We thought the same thing, I murmured quietly. We didn't see this coming either. John looked at me then, his gaze piercing, full of heartbreak and confusion. What am I supposed to do now? He asked, his voice hollow, lost. Susan reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I wish I had the answer, she whispered, tears welling up again. But you don't have to figure it out alone. We're here for you, John. Whatever you need. He stared at her hand like he didn't quite know what to do with it. How could she do this, he whispered, almost to himself. How could she just throw it all away? There was nothing we could say. No words could explain why someone you love would betray you like that. We just sat there, helpless, watching as the reality of it crushed him. I'd never felt more useless in my entire life. I trusted her, John said softly, his eyes glistening. I trusted her with everything. I know, Susan whispered. I know. He wiped at his face, anger flashing briefly before the sorrow took over again. She's my wife. She was supposed to be my partner. I don't even know who she is anymore. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, makes it hard to breathe. All I could do was watch as a good man's world came crashing down around him. I wanted to take his pain away, to fix this mess, to somehow make it all better. But I couldn't. None of us could. I need to talk to her, John finally said, his voice raw and strained. I need to hear it from her. Susan nodded slowly. I understand. I'll call her, he murmured, more to himself than to us. I'll call her and ask her why. We exchanged a glance, worry flickering between us. John, are you sure you're ready? I asked cautiously. No, he admitted, shaking his head. But I have to know. I need to know why. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Thank you, he muttered, almost as if he was in a trance. For telling me. We watched him leave, shoulders slumped, his whole body radiating defeat. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would ease the pain, but the words caught in my throat. The door closed softly behind him, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I turned to Susan, my voice shaky. What now? She looked just as lost as I felt. I don't know, Tom. I just don't know. Take some time, Susan murmured softly, her voice filled with empathy. Process this. You don't have to make any decisions right away. But I knew that wasn't really true. John was going to have to make decisions, and soon. There was no coming back from this. Emma's betrayal had blown apart their marriage, and no amount of time or reflection would put the pieces back together. John nodded slowly, but I could see the devastation in his eyes. He wasn't ready to face it yet, but he would have to. Sooner or later, he'd have to confront the harsh reality that the woman he loved had betrayed him in the worst way possible. He left not long after, moving slowly, almost as if the sheer weight of everything was bearing down on him. Susan and I watched him go, hearts heavy with guilt and sorrow. We had just torn his world apart, and there was no undoing it. We didn't speak much after that. What was there to say? We had done what we felt we had to do, but it didn't feel like the right thing. Nothing about this felt right. A few days passed in a strained, uncomfortable silence. I could see the toll it was taking on Susan. She barely slept, barely ate. The guilt was eating her alive, even though none of this was her fault. I wasn't doing much better myself. My mind kept circling back to John, wondering how he was holding up, how he was managing to cope with the truth. Then one evening, there was a knock at our door. It was John. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept in days, his face hollow, eyes bloodshot. But there was something else in his expression, a kind of calmness, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "John," I said quietly, taken aback by the sight of him standing in our doorway. But he cut straight to the point. "I've decided," he murmured, his voice low and steady. Susan and I exchanged a look, bracing ourselves for what was coming next. "I'm going to divorce her." The words hit like a punch to the gut, even though I'd known they were coming. John's tone was calm, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't a decision he'd made lightly, but it was the only decision he could make. I can't live with someone who doesn't respect me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I deserve better than that." He was right. He did deserve better. And as much as it hurt to see it, I knew this was the only way forward for him. "We're here for you," I said quietly, stepping forward to place a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you need." John nodded, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you." And just like that, the decision was made. Emma's betrayal had ended her marriage, and there was no going back. The weeks that followed were a blur, like watching a slow-motion car crash unfold. Painful, inevitable, and impossible to look away from. The reality of everything that had happened settled in around us like a heavy fog, smothering any last hope we might have held on to for Emma. Susan and I stayed in touch with John throughout the process. He moved out of the apartment almost immediately, not wanting to spend another night under the same roof as Emma after what she'd done. Susan and I helped him pack up his things, trying to offer as much support as we could, but nothing could ease the raw agony he was feeling. I remember the first time I went over to help, how he moved around in a daze, silently gathering up clothes, books, bits and pieces of his life that he'd have to leave behind. Each item seemed to carry its own sting, a reminder of the life he'd thought he was building with Emma, now broken beyond repair. "Take your time," I told him quietly, but he just shook his head. "No," he murmured. "I just want to get it over with." Susan packed boxes beside me, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She was trying so hard to be strong, to keep it together for John's sake, but I knew this was tearing her up inside. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of a dream. The dream that our daughter was the person we believed her to be. That she was capable of the love and loyalty she'd promised. John moved out, taking only the essentials, leaving behind so much more than just his belongings. I could see it in his eyes when we said goodbye in the empty apartment. He wasn't just leaving a place, he was leaving behind the life he'd imagined, the future he'd hoped for. It was all gone. The next few weeks felt surreal. Susan and I would sit in our quiet house, the silence punctuated only by the occasional phone call or message from John, updating us on the divorce proceedings. Emma, on the other hand, barely reached out. When she did, it was always brief, hollow, like she didn't really grasp the gravity of what was happening. I could feel my anger simmering, could feel the frustration building each time I thought about her. She was our daughter, but I didn't know who she was anymore. How could she do this? How could she destroy a good man like John, and act as if she was the victim? Susan was struggling too. She tried to reach out to Emma, tried to get her to see sense, to realize the destruction she'd caused, but Emma would just brush her off, saying things like, "It's complicated," or "You wouldn't understand." And maybe we didn't. Maybe we couldn't. But the one thing I did know was that she had made her bed, and now she was going to have to lie in it. For John, though, it was a different story. He was doing his best to move forward, but the heartbreak clung to him like a shadow. Each time we saw him, he looked a little more worn down, a little more haunted. "I'll be okay," he'd say whenever we asked, forcing a small, weary smile. "I just need time." But I knew it wasn't just about time. Emma had ripped something out of him that couldn't be easily replaced. It wasn't just trust. It was something deeper, something harder to regain. It was hope. And without that, I didn't know how he'd ever heal. I remember one night when Susan and I were sitting at the kitchen table, both of us worn out and drained from everything that had happened. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears, and asked, "What are we going to do, Tom? How do we fix this?" I didn't have an answer. For the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. Emma's decisions had torn apart the family we'd built, and there wasn't a way to put the pieces back together. As the divorce dragged on, Emma's behavior just got worse. It was like she didn't even care about what was happening to her marriage or to our family. When we tried talking to her, hoping to see a sliver of remorse, she brushed it off like none of it mattered. "I'm not sorry," she told us bluntly one day when we tried, one last time, to get through to her. "I'm living my life the way I want to. If you can't accept that, it's your problem, not mine." Susan broke down after that, sobbing in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't just sadness, it was betrayal. Emma hadn't just been unfaithful to John. She had betrayed us too, her own parents, who had loved her and supported her through everything. One evening, as we sat there in silence, Susan turned to me, her face a mix of pain and determination. "We need to make a decision, Tom. We can't keep living like this." I knew exactly what she meant. Emma's betrayal had gone beyond infidelity, it had fractured the very core of our family. Susan and I had tiptoed around it for weeks, not wanting to say it out loud, but now, staring at each other across the table, the reality was unavoidable. "We have to disinherit her," Susan whispered, her voice cracking. "She doesn't deserve it. She doesn't value the family. We have to set boundaries." I nodded, the heaviness of what we were deciding pressing down on me like a weight. The thought of cutting Emma off like that tore at my heart, but Susan was right. Emma had shown over and over again that she didn't care about the values we raised her with. She had tossed everything aside for some fleeting thrill, and she didn't seem to regret any of it. The next day, we made it official. We met with our lawyer and had Emma removed from our will. It was a gut-wrenching decision, but it needed to be done. We couldn't keep enabling her destructive behavior. When Emma found out, she was livid. She stormed into our house that evening, her face flushed with anger. "How could you do this to me?" she yelled, her voice trembling with fury. "I'm your daughter. You can't just cut me off like this." Susan, who had been so quiet, so withdrawn throughout this entire nightmare, finally snapped. "You're our daughter, Emma, but that doesn't give you the right to tear down everything we've worked for. You betrayed your husband. You betrayed us. We can't just sit back and pretend everything's fine." Emma's face contorted with rage, but underneath it, I saw something else. Maybe fear, maybe a hint of regret. But it didn't matter now. She had made her choices, and she was going to have to live with them. "I didn't ask to be born into your outdated ideas of family and loyalty," she spat, crossing her arms defiantly. I took a deep breath, fighting back the hurt. "And we didn't raise you to be this selfish. This isn't about some outdated notion of loyalty, Emma. It's about respect and responsibility. You hurt people, good people, without a second thought." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You just don't understand. I'm finally living my truth, and you're punishing me for it." "No, Emma," Susan said quietly, stepping forward. We're holding you accountable for the choices you've made. You're an adult now. Actions have consequences. Emma stared at her, disbelief and anger warring in her expression. So what, you're just going to cut me out of your lives? Until you show us that you've changed, yes, Susan said, her voice firm. We won't keep supporting behavior that destroys everything we value. If you want to live your truth, fine. But don't expect us to stand by and watch you tear down what's left of our family. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emma's face twisted, and for a moment, I thought she might scream at us, might lash out. But then her shoulders slumped, and her eyes darted away. Fine, she muttered, her voice low and bitter. Do whatever you want. But I'm not going to apologize for living the way I want to. We're not asking for an apology, I said quietly. We're asking for accountability. She shook her head, letting out a harsh, humorless laugh. You know what? Go ahead. Cut me out. I don't need your money, and I don't need your approval. I'm done pretending to be something I'm not. She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Susan let out a shuddering breath, her hands trembling. What have we done, Tom? She whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. She's our daughter. How did we get here? I wrapped my arms around her, feeling just as lost. I don't know. I don't know how things went so wrong. We stood there, holding each other in the empty house, the echoes of Emma's anger still lingering in the air. It felt like something had broken, something vital. And I didn't know if it would ever be whole again. Over the next few weeks, we barely heard from Emma. The house felt emptier than ever. We tried to keep in touch with John, to be there for him as much as he'd let us, but it was hard. Everything was hard. We'd lost our daughter, and it felt like we were losing ourselves in the process. Susan cried herself to sleep more nights than I could count, and I didn't know what to do to make it better. All I could do was hold on and hope that, somehow, some way, things might change. But deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that we had crossed a line, one we couldn't step back from. Afraid that our family would never be whole again. Afraid that the daughter we had once known was gone forever. You're the ones who don't understand that life isn't as black and white as you make it out to be, Emma spat, crossing her arms, her face set in defiance. That might be true, I said, stepping forward, keeping my voice steady. But there are consequences to every choice. You made your decisions, Emma, and now you have to live with them. Her eyes narrowed, and she shook her head. You're making a mistake. You're going to regret this. No, Emma, Susan said softly, her voice trembling with a sadness that ran so deep it was almost suffocating. The only regret we have is that you've turned into someone we don't even recognize. With that, Emma turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard that the walls seemed to shake. The sound echoed through the empty house, marking the end of something that had been broken long before that moment. The months that followed weren't easier, but they did become clearer. Emma drifted further and further away from us, becoming a ghost of the daughter we had once known. She didn't try to repair what was left, didn't show any sign of remorse. Instead, she buried herself in her own world, far from the values and love we had raised her with. Meanwhile, John, despite everything, remained a part of our lives. It felt strange at first, maintaining a relationship with our former son-in-law while our own daughter had become a stranger. But he had been good to us, better than we deserved, maybe, and we weren't going to push him away just because Emma had made such terrible choices. He started coming over for dinners, holidays, and even joined us for family gatherings. In many ways, he became like a son to us, the kind of person we had always dreamed Emma would be with. His presence reminded us that, even in the darkest times, there was still some light left to hold on to. As for Emma, she stayed distant. We kept our interactions to the bare minimum, exchanging cold, emotionless messages now and then, but it was obvious that the damage was beyond repair. We still loved her, We always would, but the person she had become wasn't someone we could welcome back into our lives, not without losing ourselves in the process. Time moved on, slowly but surely. Susan and I began to find a new rhythm, a new sense of peace in our relationship. We leaned on each other, navigating the painful reality of our fractured family. It wasn't easy, but we grew stronger together, finding comfort in the life we still shared. Emma's choices had cost her a place in our family, but they had also taught us a harsh truth: sometimes, love just isn't enough. Sometimes, no matter how deeply you care, people will still choose to walk a path that pulls them away from you. And as much as that realization hurt, it was a truth we had to come to terms with. Life moved forward, slowly healing the deep wounds Emma's actions had left behind. John, resilient and determined, rebuilt his life piece by piece, finding happiness again in ways I hadn't been sure he ever would. Susan and I focused on creating our own future, finding joy in the small moments, cooking dinner together, taking long walks, savoring the quiet companionship of a marriage that had survived so much. Even as the shadow of Emma's betrayal lingered in the background, we refused to let it define us. Our family would never be the same, but we had found a way to live on. And in the end, that was all we could do. We couldn't change what happened. We couldn't erase the pain or pretend that it hadn't torn us apart. But we could move forward. We could find new ways to be happy, even as we carried the weight of that loss. We would always grieve for the daughter we had lost, not to death, but to something far more complicated. And though the wound would never fully heal, life, in its own messy way, kept moving on. John eventually found someone new, a kind-hearted woman who seemed to understand his brokenness and love him all the more for it. When he told us he was getting remarried, there was a bittersweet joy in knowing he'd found a second chance at happiness. We attended his wedding, feeling a mix of sadness and hope, watching as he stepped forward into a future that Emma would never be a part of. As for Susan and me, we took things day by day, finding comfort in each other's presence, drawing strength from the life we still had. Emma was gone, drifting further away with each passing year, but she hadn't taken everything from us. We had survived. And in the end, sometimes that's the best you can hope for. We'll never know if Emma will ever find her way back, if she'll ever reach out to mend what's been broken. But even if she doesn't, we've come to accept that too. Life goes on. Even with the scars. Even with the pain. We find a way to keep moving forward. Because in the end, that's all we have left.